Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we want to talk again about one of the men who over time in Pensacola made a great difference. And this gentleman was Ezekiel Simpson, the great lumberman of Santa Rosa County and of course also of Pensacola itself. Ezekiel Simpson was born to a family that had migrated into this area well before Florida became part of the United States. They operated in what we today call Santa Rosa County, and Simpson, his brother, and his father had a tiny lumber mill that was actually operating when Andrew Jackson arrived here and we became part of the American nation. Within a couple of years, that little mill began to prosper even more because their output was needed for the materials that would be used in the construction of the Navy Yard and subsequently in the forts. So that over the next 15 to 20 years, that was basically the market that they had. But by the time we get into serious fort building, Simpson had one other very, well, I guess we would call it a need, a very unique situation. His business was very good, but he needed capital to expand. And at this point, he came in contact with a man named Joseph Forsyth, who had come to Escambia County from New Orleans. And the story about Forsyth itself, we have to take a little bit of a side turn here to mention this. Forsyth's background is a little bit of a mystery. He arrived, he had apparently a lot of money, and there always has been some speculation, where did he get it? Some people, one story was that he had been involved in some nefarious business over there and skipped out with the capital. Another was that he had been involved in some sort of a murder mystery and so he had the money. But whatever the reason, Joseph Forsyth had it. He combined with Ezekiel Simpson, and they enlarged the little mill that the Simpson family had and built a further addition to it on what is called Pond Creek on the outskirts of Milton. They dammed up Pond Creek, created water power for the mill, and it went further in supplying not only the needs of the fort builder, Captain Chase, but also now they began to develop markets beyond this. They began selling lumber that was being shipped by water to Caribbean islands and also to East Texas. This came after 1835 when Texas itself became an independent country. Well, as all of this moved forward, Forsyth had another idea. He had traveled a good bit and he went up into North Carolina where in the center of that state they were just putting in place what we would today call an integrated cotton mill. This was a mill in which they began with raw cotton, spun it, wove it, and ultimately actually produced materials from it, garments and other things from it. And Forsyth came back and said, now look, we're farmers here in this area just to the east of us are successfully growing cotton. Why don't we create such a mill ourselves? And Simpson agreed that they should. And so, as a companion business, right at alongside of the lumber mill at Pond Creek, they erected their single source cotton mill. It was a unique place. They bought 75 Negro women as they were slaves, and they were basically the operators within the mill. And it moved off very successfully at the beginning. Well, we moved forward just about 5 years into the early part of the 1850s, and by now something new has entered the picture as far as lumbering is concerned. By now, there have been successful applications of steam power to the equipment, which was, of course, the steam power was much superior to the water power which had been used on Pond Creek. And so Simpson decided that he was going to move the lumber mill from the site of the Pond Creek over to the edge of the Blackwater River. Now, over the time of the mill, in the recent years, virtually all of the output of the mill had been moved from the Pond Creek area, the Milton area, to what we would today call Baghdad on the Blackwater, and that was where it was loaded on ships or barges for shipment. Now Simpson was going to relocate his mill and put it right there, right at the very source of the shipping site, and so this is what he did. He rebuilt the mill with all of the new advantages and technology of steam power, and as he did this, he also had to begin what we would today call a company town, and this is when the village of of Baghdad was created. And basically what they began to do, of course, was put the houses and all of the complementary services that a community would need. Simpson and his associates built the church, the store, the community, the school, everything that was needed, and put it there. Well, about this same time, Mr. Forsyth unfortunately died. He had been a very successful politician as well as a mill owner, but as Forsyth passed from the scene, Simpson felt that the operation of the cotton mill was really not to the level of success that he wanted. It was taking more of his time than he wanted, and so the cotton enterprise was closed down, and everything related to lumber now shifted to the Blackwater River. And it was highly successful, continued to be highly successful. The mill grew, the community grew. And then we came close, of course, to the year 1866, the years 1860, 61, and the war clouds were moving in. Well, Mr. Simpson was a very far-sighted gentleman, and he appreciated that the South had a position and he was going to support it, but he was wise enough, and this is early now in the year 1861, before any hostilities occurred. Mr. Simpson took a substantial part of his capital in cash and had one of his trusted assistants go by vessel to New York City, where that money was invested in federal bonds. And that money, of course, that investment, of course, drew a considerable interest all through the war years. And while Mr. Simpson was a supporter of the South, bought Southern bonds, even paid with his own funds to equip an entire military company that was formed in the Pensacola area. Nonetheless, he also had hedged his bet, I guess that's the right term, by having the money invested in the North. Well, came the month of May of 1862, and the Southern troops were all withdrawn from this area, and as they retreated, of course, order was given that every mill, every inventory that might give aid and comfort to the incoming Yankees, all of this was to be destroyed, and the Simpson mill on the Blackwater was burned to the ground. Well, as that happened, of course, everyone else fled, and the Pensacola and Baghdad were literally, they were ghost towns for the next 3.5 years. When the war ended, Simpson came back, and of course, by now, with the war was ended, he was able to send to New York and bring back the earnings that all of the capital he invested there and their earnings. He immediately was able to rebuild his mill on the Blackwater using all of the technology that had come into place over the years, over the 4 years, and the Civil War was not different than any other. When war takes place, new technologies are available, are developed, and Simpson took advantage of these, and the mill that he built there in 1866-67 was bigger and better than ever. Well, again, Simpson was smart. He also was very lucky. Now, he had no sooner put the new mill on stream in manufacturing when the great lumbering era began. Orders for lumber from Europe began to pour in. Simpson's was the only mill we had at that point in time that was ready to produce and ship. Well, of course, within a matter of months, other mills began to be placed in this area, but Simpson's would remain the largest mill of its time well into the future. Unfortunately for our story, Ezekiel Simpson died in 1873. But by the time he arrived, he had brought into the area a whole host of very able people with names like Overman and Roberts and Bushnell and Thompson and Creary, and these men carried on the work that he had done. Now, those who live in the area here and who have an opportunity to do so can get some idea of what this wonderful Simpson Lumber Company was able to do, because the village of Baghdad was a picture village of its time. It had everything that you could imagine. Simpson was a very, very far-sighted and compassionate employer. He made sure that his people lived well, that all of the services that they were required would be there, and the men who followed him carried this on beautifully well into the future. Well, Simpson himself, as I say, died in 1873 and was buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Pensacola. His tomb is rather unique. It's a rather effective affair. It's a mausoleum, but it is not above ground. It is a very sizable one, and it is subterranean. Beautifully done, lots of marble work in it, nice sets of iron railings around it, and of course very carefully leveled steps to take one who is visiting the the tomb there take right down to the viewing level. Of course, other members of the Simpson family were buried there as well. To complete the story of what this gentleman did, the Simpson Lumber Company continued on very successfully in its Baghdad location into the 20th century. And in 1906, with some members of the family wishing to go into other fields of endeavor, the mill was sold to an organization coming out of the Midwest, and that company put itself together and continued the work. They extended the railroad, which the Simpson employees had begun, the Woodlands Railroad, and the railroad for Simpson Lumber Company was a huge affair. Some say that it had almost 200 miles of track back and forth all the way up to the border of the state of Alabama. And this, of course, was one of the reasons the mill succeeded so successfully, kept its costs under control. That operation continued that way for about 10 to 12 years, and then it was sold to still another family, and this family took it over. This was basically those some who would remember the names, of course, this was the Henderson family. They purchased it and continued the operations beautifully, working on in the same ways until the Great Depression came. And it was in 1938 that the decision was made that the operation could no longer be sustained, and in 1938 the Simpson Lumber Company closed. Now that didn't mean that Baghdad closed down or anything like that. Baghdad remained a viable city and continued to be a part of the community as well. Now, if I come back to our friend Ezekiel Simpson one more time, I have to mention one or two things about him of a personal nature. Mr. Simpson was a very religious man. He and his other members of his family were among the original contingent that joined Old Christ Church to become a community church here, which had 4 different denominations under the one roof. And in 1845, when the Presbyterians elected to split off, Mr. Simpson was one of those who was a very generous benefactor to the church, helping to build the new wooden structure that the Presbyterians erected at 234 East Intendencia. And he even purchased the bell for the church, which was used there, and then moved when that church relocated many years later. It moved to Chase Street. That bell was moved over there, put in the steeple, and when another move was made in 1968, the bell was preserved, and the First Presbyterian Church still has it. So people look back on the things that Simpson did, not only as a lumberman, but also as a benefactor to the community. Part of the time during his life, he had a large family home here in the community on East Gregory Street. He remained a benefactor to the community because he not only was he generous in his religious beliefs, but he was very generous to the community, helping to fund some of the things that came on stream early on. For example, and I don't have the figures on this specifically, but it is apparent that Mr. Simpson was one of those who stepped forward in the late 1890s and made a contribution that allowed others to start what was known as the Pearl Egan Home, which was, of course, the forerunner of our Children's Home Society today. Mr. Simpson, I don't have record that he was a joiner. I don't think he was a mason or a member of one of the lodges, but nonetheless, he was a man who helped build a fine community in Pensacola, and also a fine and surviving community that we appreciate today on the Blackwater in Baghdad. So that's the story. Ezekiel Simpson, from a family that was here prior to the beginning of the American period, and whose work did so many good things for us over time. Ezekiel Simpson, like Francis Brent and Al Lee and some of the others, have just done wonderful things for Pensacola. They are men who are long gone, but we certainly deserve and should remember them.